Why did Wyoming give women voting rights 51 years before America, then try to take it back to save $3 a day? Welcome to 71 Dumbest Things About Wyoming, exposing real historical facts like cattle barons hiring a private army to invade their own state, a river that vanishes underground for 25 years with zero explanation, and laws so backwards your jaw will drop. Plus, the biggest myth, Yellowstone is not a pretty park. It is a supervolcano that could bury half of America. Hit subscribe before we reveal everything. 1. Wyoming has a secret your geography teacher definitely forgot. The entire state, all 600,000 people, produces fewer residents than a single New York City subway line carries on a random Tuesday. Some guy named Kevin, squished against a pole on the A train, technically represents a statistically significant slice of Wyoming's total population. They call it the equality state. Equal to a subway car, absolutely incredible. 2. Wyoming sits on a supervolcano so catastrophically massive that a full eruption would bury half of America under volcanic ash. And Wyoming's response to this terrifying information was to build a tourist resort directly on top of it. Scientists call it one of the most dangerous geological features on Earth. Wyoming called it a business opportunity. Visitors pay hundreds of dollars to sleep approximately 12 feet above something that could end American civilization before checkout time. 3. Back in 1869, Wyoming gave women the right to vote 51 years before the rest of America, which sounds heroic until you hear why repeal almost happened. Lawmakers decided paying women $3 a day for jury duty was financially catastrophic and drafted a bill stripping voting rights entirely just to dodge the fee. The governor vetoed it. Wyoming kept women's suffrage, almost lost democracy over $3. 4. Somehow the biggest American corruption scandal before Watergate got named after a Wyoming rock shaped like a teapot. The Teapot Dome scandal of 1921 involved a government official secretly handing Wyoming's federal oil reserves to private cronies for bribes, and the entire criminal empire got named after kitchen equipment sitting in the middle of nowhere. Wyoming accidentally named America's most embarrassing political scandal after a teapot. Remarkable contribution to history. 5. Nobody told the pronghorn antelope that their predator went extinct 10,000 years ago, because they are still sprinting across Wyoming at 55 miles per hour with absolutely nothing chasing them. Pronghorns evolved to outrun a cheetah-like creature that vanished completely, yet today they remain the fastest land animal in the Western Hemisphere, running full speed from a threat that has not existed since the Ice Age, completely unaware, forever running. 6. 90 people total run Wyoming's entire state legislature, which is smaller than most American high school student councils. These 90 individuals sitting in one room make binding laws for a state spanning nearly 100,000 square miles. California's legislature has far more members governing similar landmass. Wyoming essentially operates its entire government with the organizational structure of a medium-sized parent-teacher association meeting held on a random Tuesday evening. 7. No state income tax and no state sales tax sounds like absolute paradise until the catastrophic catch becomes clear. Wyoming's entire government runs almost completely on taxing coal and oil pulled from the ground, meaning schools, roads, and hospitals depend entirely on one single dying industry. The moment fossil fuels stop being profitable, Wyoming has no backup plan whatsoever. The whole state is essentially one enormous and very optimistic geological gamble. 8. Wealthy Wyoming cattle barons in 1892 hired 25 armed Texas gunmen, loaded them onto a private train, and invaded their own state to massacre small ranchers they disliked. The mercenary army killed 2 men before locals fought back so aggressively that the United States Army physically rode in to stop the invasion. Wyoming cattle barons started a war inside their own state using imported Texas mercenaries and still managed to lose. 9. Calling itself the cowboy state on every license plate and tourism brochure becomes genuinely awkward when you realize more Wyoming residents work for the government than for ranching and agriculture combined. The single largest employer in the cowboy state is pure bureaucracy. Cowboys are the mascot. Government paperwork is the actual economy. Wyoming has been marketing itself using a professional identity that statistically represents a minority of its own workforce for decades. 10. Flipping an entire loaded Union Pacific Railroad car completely off the tracks using nothing but wind sounds impossible. Yet Wyoming did exactly that in 1878 with zero other contributing factors. Wind derailments became such a documented recurring engineering crisis that designers spent decades creating specific solutions exclusively for Wyoming conditions. The state's weather regularly threw entire trains around like cheap plastic toys. Wyoming wind was not inconvenient, it was catastrophic. 11. Fort Laramie hosted the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty, the largest gathering of Native American nations ever recorded in history, where thousands of indigenous people assembled to negotiate peace. The United States government signed every single term of that treaty, and then broke every single one of them within 15 years. The biggest diplomatic gathering in Native American history ended with America simply ignoring everything it formally promised. Every single term. Gone. 12. Buried underneath Wyoming's surface lies the highest concentration of dinosaur fossils in the entire Western Hemisphere, making the whole state essentially one enormous prehistoric graveyard. Ranchers accidentally dig up T-Rex bones while installing fence posts. Farmers hit Brachiosaurus remains while plowing fields. Wyoming residents are literally walking over millions of years of ancient death every single day without realizing what is directly beneath their boots. 13. Cheyenne holds the official title of least populous state capital in the entire United States, smaller than Dayton, Ohio, a city most Americans genuinely struggle to locate on a map. Wyoming's capital city would not even qualify as a mid-sized suburb in Texas or Florida. Yet Cheyenne controls an entire state government, manages billions in mineral revenues, and somehow remains smaller than neighborhoods that most Americans have never bothered visiting. 14. Calamity Jane gets celebrated across Wyoming as the ultimate frontier heroine, appearing on murals, statues, and tourism posters absolutely everywhere, which makes the actual historical record genuinely uncomfortable. The real Calamity Jane was banned from multiple Wyoming Army posts for repeated drunken misconduct and disruptive behavior, not for any celebrated act of heroism. Wyoming built an entire cultural identity around a woman the Army repeatedly kicked out for being too rowdy. 15. Stretching across over 100 square miles of Wyoming sits Kilpecker Sand Dunes, the largest active sand dunes in the entire United States, inside a state that every single American pictures as nothing but mountains, cowboys, and snow. Massive rolling sand dunes in Wyoming. The state has an entire Sahara-style desert ecosystem sitting completely unannounced inside its borders, and almost nobody outside Wyoming has ever heard about it existing. 16. Half of all land in Wyoming is owned by the federal government, meaning Wyoming citizens literally do not own the ground beneath their feet across an enormous portion of their own state. Ranchers graze cattle on land Washington controls. Miners extract resources from ground they do not own. Wyoming residents pay taxes to a state that technically cannot even claim half its own territory. Half the state belongs to someone else entirely. 17. Nellie Taylor Ross made history in Wyoming in 1925 by becoming the first female governor in American history, a genuine landmark moment for the self-proclaimed equality state. Wyoming voters then looked at their historic achievement, thought carefully about it, and promptly replaced her with a man just 2 years later. The state that pioneered women's equality in voting decided that pioneering women's equality in governing was apparently one step too progressive. 18. Wyoming's public school system is constitutionally funded by coal and mineral royalties pulled from the ground, which sounds stable until you realize what that actually means long-term. If the fossil fuel industry collapses, Wyoming schools do not just lose funding, they legally collapse alongside it. Every classroom, every teacher's salary, every school bus is financially tied to a single extractive industry currently in documented long-term structural decline. No coal, no school. 19. Standing on Wyoming's continental divide means 2 raindrops landing inches apart on the exact same mountain will flow in completely opposite directions toward completely opposite oceans. 1 raindrop travels west toward the Pacific. The other travels east toward the Atlantic. The same cloud, the same storm, the same mountain, producing water molecules that will never meet again for the rest of geological time. Wyoming sits on the literal spine of an entire continent. 20. Wyoming has more functioning saloons per capita than any other state in America, which tells you everything important about Wyoming's infrastructure priorities. There is genuinely better organized public infrastructure for drinking alcohol than for public transportation across the entire state. No passenger rail, minimal bus service, but an absolutely thriving network of bars in every tiny town. Wyoming solved the wrong problem extremely efficiently and seems completely unbothered by this fact. 21. John Wesley Powell launched his legendary and completely terrifying 1869 Colorado River expedition directly from Green River, Wyoming, with wooden boats and almost no supplies. Local Wyoming residents publicly announced he would die, called the entire mission insane, and gathered specifically to watch his departure like it was a public execution. Powell survived, mapped the entire Grand Canyon, and became an American legend. The locals who predicted his death were never mentioned again. 22. Sinks Canyon in Wyoming features a river that flows normally until it simply vanishes completely underground, reappearing a full quarter-mile away as if nothing unusual happened. Scientists studied this geological phenomenon for over 25 years without being able to definitively prove where the water went during its underground journey. An entire river disappearing into the earth, and nobody could explain it for decades. Wyoming has a river that plays hide-and-seek. 23. Passenger rail service in Wyoming was completely eliminated in 1983 and has never returned, meaning today you cannot travel between any Wyoming cities by train under any circumstances. No Amtrak, no regional rail, nothing. Wyoming is one of the largest states geographically in America and has absolutely zero public train options connecting its communities. The only state transportation solution available is driving yourself across hundreds of empty miles in a personal vehicle. 24. Jackson Hole Ski Resort in Wyoming sells lift tickets that reach $265 per single day, making it officially the most expensive skiing in America. The genuinely ridiculous part is that most actual Wyoming residents who live nearby cannot afford to ski there at all. The resort sits inside Wyoming, employs Wyoming workers, and charges prices that make it completely inaccessible to the actual Wyoming population surrounding it. 25. Bighorn Medicine Wheel is a massive ancient stone structure built by Native Americans that predates Stonehenge, sitting quietly on a Wyoming mountaintop for thousands of years. When European settlers discovered it, their immediate response was using it for target practice. For decades, this irreplaceable archaeological monument absorbed bullet damage from passing settlers who treated a structure older than most civilizations like a casual shooting range. Wyoming settlers found ancient history and shot at it. 26. Constitutional carry in Wyoming means any resident can carry a concealed firearm anywhere in the state, with no permit required, no safety training required, and no background check required beyond the initial purchase. Absolutely nothing stands between a Wyoming resident and carrying a hidden weapon in any public space. Restaurants, parks, stores, government buildings. Wyoming decided the constitutional right needed zero administrative guardrails whatsoever and implemented that decision completely and enthusiastically. 27. Every single year, the federal government spends over $50 million housing and feeding wild horses rounded up across Wyoming, which raises an obvious question about what happens to them afterward. The answer is that they sit in government holding facilities indefinitely because nobody wants them and they cannot be released. America is spending $50 million annually maintaining a population of horses that have no owner, no purpose, and no destination. 28. Butch Cassidy's hole-in-the-wall hideout in Wyoming was not a myth or a movie invention, but a real physical canyon so remote and naturally defensible that pursuing posses repeatedly rode up to the entrance, looked inside, and turned completely around without entering. Professional lawmen with legal authority and armed backup repeatedly decided the canyon was simply not worth attempting. Butch Cassidy found the one geographic feature in America that made law enforcement voluntarily give up. 29. NASA actively studies Wyoming's Vidawu rock formations as surface analogs for Mars terrain, meaning scientists use Wyoming geology to train astronauts and test equipment for actual Mars missions. Wyoming dirt is currently being used to simulate another planet. Researchers drive rovers across Wyoming landscapes, practicing for conditions 60 million miles away. Wyoming is simultaneously one of the least visited states in America and an active training ground for interplanetary exploration. 30. Wyoming hosted the first transatlantic telegraph relay station in the continental United States, connecting America to the entire world through this remote western territory, which makes it genuinely baffling that Wyoming today ranks among the worst states in the nation for rural broadband internet access. Wyoming was literally the communications hub of 19th century America. In the 21st century, Wyoming residents struggled to load a web page. Historic achievement, catastrophic follow-through. 31. Devil's Tower became America's very first national monument in 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt personally declared it protected, which sounds like a celebrated moment of conservation history. Local Wyoming ranchers responded by immediately filing lawsuits demanding the designation get reversed. The people living closest to one of America's most dramatic geological formations fought legally to remove its protection. Roosevelt ignored them completely. Devil's Tower stayed protected. The ranchers lost and never quite forgave Teddy. 32. Glaciers across Wyoming's Wind River Range have lost over 50% of their total mass since scientists began measuring them in the early 1900s, and the retreat continues accelerating every single decade. These are not small ice patches either, but massive ancient glaciers that shaped Wyoming's entire mountain landscape over thousands of years. Half of them are simply gone now. Wyoming is watching its defining geological features disappear in real time, with no ability to stop it. 33. Thermopolis. Hot Springs in Wyoming releases over 8,000 gallons of mineral water every single minute, ranking among the largest hot spring systems anywhere on Earth. The genuinely remarkable part is that Wyoming's state constitution legally guarantees free public access to a portion of those springs, meaning no corporation can ever fully privatize them. Wyoming constitutionally protected free hot spring access before protecting almost anything else. Priorities were unusual, but the hot springs decision was genuinely correct. 34. Wyoming is the only state in America whose borders have never once been adjusted, renegotiated, or debated since original establishment, forming a perfect geometric rectangle on every map. The reason is not careful planning or diplomatic achievement, but simply that zero meaningful negotiation ever occurred between any parties involved. Nobody argued about Wyoming's borders because nobody particularly cared enough to argue. Wyoming became a perfect rectangle entirely through widespread governmental indifference toward its existence. 35. One single night in 1909 during the Spring Creek Raid, masked gunmen hired by cattle ranchers rode through Wyoming darkness and systematically slaughtered over 10,000 sheep belonging to competing herders. 10,000 animals killed in one night by hired masked attackers. This documented range war atrocity was so extreme and so undeniable that it actually resulted in real murder convictions, making it one of the few Wyoming range war incidents where anyone faced actual consequences. 36. Sitting quietly outside Cheyenne, Wyoming's Warren Air Force Base currently houses active Minuteman III nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, making this tiny Wyoming city statistically one of the most heavily nuclear-armed locations on Earth per capita. The least populous state capital in America simultaneously holds enough nuclear firepower to end multiple civilizations. Cheyenne cannot sustain a major league sports team, but maintains an arsenal capable of destroying countries. Wyoming's priorities remain consistently difficult to explain. 37. Average Wyoming counties are larger than the entire state of Connecticut, creating a land-to-people ratio so extreme that basic governmental functions become almost mathematically impossible to perform efficiently. One county commissioner might be personally responsible for infrastructure across an area bigger than a small northeastern state, containing only a few thousand residents total. Wyoming governance requires covering Connecticut-sized territories to serve populations smaller than a single Connecticut town. The math never works favorably. 38. Since 2008, Wyoming's coal production has fallen over 40% and continues declining every year, which would be a manageable economic problem for most states, but becomes existential for Wyoming specifically. Coal is not just one industry among many in Wyoming, but essentially the singular financial foundation supporting the entire state budget. Roads, schools, hospitals, and government salaries all flow from coal revenues. Wyoming is watching its only real economic engine systematically dismantle itself decade by decade. 39. Range detectives operating across Wyoming in the late 1800s were privately hired armed agents paid directly by wealthy cattle associations to monitor suspected rustlers across open rangeland. Several documented cases confirmed these range detectives did not simply surveil suspects, but killed them with zero legal authority, zero oversight, and zero consequences. Private corporations were funding private assassins operating openly across Wyoming territory. Law enforcement existed, but cattle association money operated completely above it. 40. Wyoming's high altitude creates UV radiation exposure so intense that the state records one of the highest melanoma skin cancer diagnosis rates per capita in the entire United States. Residents living among some of America's most spectacular mountain scenery are simultaneously absorbing dangerous levels of solar radiation simply by existing outdoors at elevation. Wyoming's breathtaking landscape comes with a genuine medical consequence that tourism brochures consistently forget mentioning anywhere in their promotional materials. 41. Running through Wyoming. From the 1820s through the 1840s, the Green River served as the primary commercial highway of the entire American fur trade, functioning as the economic engine powering westward expansion across the continent. Billions of dollars worth of beaver pelts traveled this Wyoming river system, while mountain men conducted annual trading gatherings on its banks. The economic engine of American expansion ran directly through Wyoming, and most Americans today have never heard of it. 42. Wyoming actually jailed men in the early 1900s under criminal syndicalism laws simply for distributing labor union pamphlets on public streets, making political literature distribution a prosecutable criminal offense. Normal American citizens exercising what most people consider basic constitutional rights were arrested, charged, and imprisoned specifically for handing strangers pieces of paper containing Union information. Wyoming criminalized pamphlets. The cowboy state was apparently also the anti-pamphlet state for several uncomfortable decades. 43. Fossil Butte. National Monument in Wyoming contains fish fossils preserved so perfectly from 50 million years ago that individual scales, individual fins, and actual stomach contents remain completely visible inside the stone today. Not outlines, not impressions. Actual biological detail frozen in rock for 50 million years. Scientists can examine what these fish ate for their last meal 500 million years before humans existed. Wyoming's ground preserves ancient lunch menus in perfect detail. 44. During the catastrophic winter of 1887, Wyoming blizzards buried entire homestead cabins completely to the roofline under accumulated snow, trapping families inside their own homes for weeks at a stretch. These were not temporary inconveniences, but genuine survival situations where families lived entirely underground beneath snow for extended periods with limited food and no outside contact. Wyoming winters in 1887 did not inconvenience settlers. They literally buried them alive under their own rooftops. 45. Wyoming's official state flower is the Indian paintbrush, which appears delicate and colorful and completely innocent growing across mountain meadows, hiding a genuinely sinister botanical secret. Indian paintbrush is partially parasitic, secretly inserting its roots into neighboring plants and stealing nutrients without providing anything in return while appearing completely beautiful above ground. Wyoming chose a parasitic plant as its floral symbol. A flower that survives by secretly robbing its neighbors represents the entire state officially. 46. Airs. Natural Bridge in Wyoming ranks among only 3 natural bridges on Earth, where a river flows actively and permanently through the arch rather than beneath or beside it, making it one of the rarest geological formations anywhere on the planet. This extraordinarily rare global landmark sits completely unmarked down a rural Wyoming back road with minimal signage and almost zero tourism infrastructure. One of Earth's rarest natural features, and Wyoming barely bothered telling anyone about it. 47. Wyoming's state quarter, released by the U.S. Mint in 2007, proudly features a bucking horse as its central design, which sounds appropriately Western until you realize Wyoming had already been using that exact same bucking horse image on its license plates continuously since 1936. The U.S. Mint spent considerable resources designing a commemorative coin, and Wyoming submitted artwork it had already been mass-producing for 71 years. Least original coin submission in American mint history by a significant margin. 48. Wyoming's overthrust belt contains massive oil reserves locked inside geological formations so complicated and structurally unusual that early 20th century drillers spent decades hitting completely dry holes before modern extraction technology finally made the reserves accessible. Billions of dollars worth of oil sat directly beneath Wyoming ground for generations while drillers repeatedly failed to reach it. Wyoming was sitting on enormous petroleum wealth the entire time and simply could not figure out how to get it. 49. More federal wilderness area per capita exists in Wyoming than in any other continental state, permanently locking away enormous stretches of land that cannot be developed, cannot be taxed, and cannot generate the revenue Wyoming's budget desperately requires. Wyoming simultaneously has more protected wilderness than almost anywhere else, and a state budget perpetually struggling for adequate funding. The most protected state in America cannot develop the very land that would solve its financial problems. 50. Grand Prismatic. Spring's spectacular rainbow colors, the most photographed natural feature in all of Yellowstone, are produced entirely by real living heat-adapted bacteria, rather than any mineral or chemical process. The vivid orange, yellow, and green rings surrounding the boiling blue center are completely biological organisms thriving in near-boiling water. Wyoming's most visually stunning natural landmark is not a geological phenomenon, but essentially a massive bacterial colony that happens to look extraordinarily beautiful from above. 51. Oregon Trail, Mormon Trail, and Pony Express route all overlapped and ran simultaneously through Wyoming during the 1850s, meaning three of the most historically celebrated American pathways converged through the same territory simultaneously. Three separate iconic American journeys sharing the same Wyoming dirt at the same time, carrying settlers, saints, and mail across identical ground toward different destinations. Wyoming hosted the greatest concentration of American westward movement history and somehow remains the state everyone consistently forgets exists. 52. Leasing federal coal reserves to private energy companies at documented below-market rates means Wyoming is effectively allowing corporations to extract publicly owned resources and sell them for private profit while American taxpayers receive less than fair market value in return. The public owns the coal. Private companies extract it cheaply. Corporations sell it at full market price. Taxpayers fund the difference. Wyoming has been running this particular arrangement for decades and calling it standard business practice. 53. Pinedale. Wyoming contains a full dedicated museum of the mountain man, an entire institutional building celebrating fur trappers whose complete industry collapsed into total commercial extinction by 1840, barely 20 years after reaching its peak popularity. Wyoming built a permanent museum, honoring a profession that self-destructed within a single generation through complete overharvesting of available resources. The mountain man industry destroyed itself entirely, and Wyoming responded by constructing a building commemorating the destruction professionally. 54. Cattle ranchers across Wyoming receive federal grazing subsidies allowing them to graze livestock on public land at rates documented well below fair market value, saving ranching operations millions annually in operating costs. These same ranchers consistently elect officials who campaign loudly and repeatedly on eliminating federal government interference in Western state affairs. Wyoming ranchers are simultaneously the loudest critics of federal government involvement and among the most financially dependent recipients of federal government generosity anywhere in America. 55. Jackson Hole Valley sits directly above a geological fault system, making it among the most seismically active regions in the entire continental United States, outside California, experiencing regular measurable earthquake activity beneath one of America's most expensive and exclusive resort destinations. Wealthy visitors pay premium prices to ski and vacation directly above ground that moves, shifts, and shakes with documented regularity. Jackson Hole sells luxury experiences on top of one of America's most geologically unstable locations. 56. Yellowstone Lake sits at 7,733 feet elevation, making it the largest high-altitude lake in all of North America. And directly beneath its surface sits an active volcanic bulge that scientists have confirmed measurably rises and falls every single year. The lake floor is literally breathing. The ground beneath the most visited lake in Wyoming inhales and exhales annually like a geological lung. Tourists boat across it completely unaware the bottom is moving. 57. Active mud volcanoes bubbling inside Yellowstone reach internal temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit, making them genuine superheated geological hazards capable of causing severe burns within seconds of contact. And Wyoming allows tourists to walk directly to the edge and peer inside them regularly. No mandatory barriers. Minimal required distances. Visitors from across America lean over boiling mud craters and take photographs inches away from temperatures that would cause serious injury almost instantaneously. Wyoming considers this acceptable tourism. 58. Wyoming's official 1880 territorial census recorded more surveyed pronghorn antelope than human residents across multiple counties, meaning government documents formally acknowledge that animals outnumbered people on official American paperwork. This was not an estimate or approximation, but actual documented census data submitted to the federal government confirming Wyoming counties contained more wildlife than citizens. Wyoming submitted paperwork to Washington proving its own counties had more antelopes than voters. The federal government accepted this information without apparent concern. 59. Wyoming sends exactly one single representative to the United States House of Representatives for its entire population of 600,000 people, meaning one person speaks for the entire state in the lower chamber of American Congress. One human being casts votes representing every Wyoming citizen's congressional voice simultaneously. For comparison, California sends 52 representatives for its population. Wyoming gets one. One representative, one vote, representing an entire American state the size of the United Kingdom. 60. Cheyenne Frontier Days. Rodeo has operated continuously every single year without one interruption since 1897, surviving 2 world wars, the Great Depression, multiple pandemics, and every conceivable national crisis without canceling once. This Wyoming rodeo is older than most nations founded during the 20th century and has demonstrated more institutional continuity than several actual governments. Wyoming could not maintain passenger rail service past 1983, but has maintained an unbroken rodeo tradition for over 120 years. 61. Driving over 20,000 miles annually, Wyoming households rank among the highest in the entire nation for personal vehicle usage, not because residents enjoy long drives, but because owning a car is a basic biological survival requirement in this state. No trains, minimal buses, 0 alternative transportation options exist between communities separated by hundreds of empty miles. Wyoming residents do not choose to drive everywhere. Geography simply removes every other available option completely. 62. Johnson County had no functioning courthouse for years following the 1892 Range War invasion, because the cattle barons who funded the entire mercenary operation were so extraordinarily politically powerful that prosecutors could not assemble a functional legal case against anyone involved. 25 hired gunmen invaded Wyoming, killed people, and went home completely unpunished. The most dramatic violent event in Wyoming political history ended with 0 convictions, 0 accountability, and the cattle barons returning to business immediately afterward. 63. Laramie Mountains contain exposed Precambrian rock sitting openly on the surface that formed over 2.5 billion years ago, making it among the oldest visible surface rock anywhere in North America. This ancient stone existed before complex life appeared on Earth, before fish evolved, before dinosaurs, before nearly everything recognizable in natural history. Wyoming residents drive past 2.5 billion-year-old rock formations, daily treating them as completely unremarkable background scenery. 64. Entire railroad towns appeared from nothing, exploded into chaotic boom towns containing thousands of residents, and vanished back into empty Wyoming dirt within single calendar years during Union Pacific construction through the 1860s. These were not small camps but functioning towns with saloons, businesses, and established populations that ceased existing completely within months. Wyoming hosted dozens of towns that lived and died faster than most American business startups. Here today, completely erased tomorrow, leaving nothing behind. 65. South Pass represented the only genuinely practical wagon route through the Rocky Mountains for thousands of miles in either direction, meaning the entire westward migration of 19th century America had no choice but funneling through one specific Wyoming mountain gap. Every pioneer family, every Mormon settler, every California gold rusher heading west passed through this single Wyoming location. The entire population movement that built the American West squeezed through one Wyoming mountain pass like water through a keyhole. 66. Riverside. Wyoming recorded the coldest wind chill temperature in documented United States history in 1989, reaching -66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is measurably colder than the surface temperature Mars experiences on a relatively warm Martian day. Wyoming achieved temperatures colder than another planet during what was technically just a regular winter weather event. Scientists recorded it. Officials documented it. Wyoming residents who survived it reportedly described the experience as simply an unpleasant Tuesday in January. 67. Wyoming's fence-out doctrine remains active law today, meaning if a rancher's cattle wander onto your private property and destroy your garden, crops, or landscaping, legal responsibility falls entirely on you for failing to construct adequate fencing, preventing their entry. The animal owner bears zero liability. The property owner absorbs all damages. Wyoming decided centuries ago that cattle movement takes legal priority over private property protection and has maintained this position enthusiastically through every subsequent legislative session. 68. Lander cutoff along the Oregon Trail saved emigrant wagon trains several weeks of difficult travel time, making it seemingly an obvious routing choice. Except that pioneer journals from the 1850s consistently described this Wyoming stretch as the single most feared section of the entire westward journey. Travelers who had crossed deserts, forded rivers, and climbed mountain passes specifically dreaded the Lander cutoff more than anything else encountered previously. Wyoming made the shortcut somehow more terrifying than the long way. 69. Carbon. Wyoming holds the unique distinction of being the only documented case in American history where an entire functioning town was physically dismantled building by building and relocated when the railroad moved its line, then subsequently abandoned completely and buried when the coal deposits ran out entirely. A whole town moved once, then disappeared forever. Carbon existed, relocated, and vanished without leaving meaningful traces. Wyoming has a town whose entire existence fits inside one genuinely sad sentence. 70. Wyoming's official state song is Home on the Range, which presents one immediate and rather significant problem. Home on the Range was written in Kansas, subsequently adopted enthusiastically by multiple other states, and maintains absolutely zero specific historical or cultural connection to Wyoming whatsoever. Wyoming selected another state's song as its official musical identity. The cowboy state represents itself musically using a song that Kansas wrote, other states claimed, and Wyoming simply decided to also adopt anyway. 71. Yellowstone became America's first national park in 1872, and Devil's Tower became America's first national monument in 1906, meaning Wyoming accidentally pioneered the entire American conservation movement twice within 34 years while simply attempting to attract more visitors and generate tourism revenue. Wyoming did not set out to revolutionize how America protects its natural landscapes. Wyoming set out to sell more hotel rooms. The entire American conservation movement was essentially an accidental Wyoming tourism marketing side effect. Wyoming, a state smaller than a subway car, sitting on a supervolcano funded by a dying industry, governed by 90 people, and somehow still calling itself the equality state with a completely straight face. Which one of these 71 facts absolutely broke your brain today? Drop it in the comments right now. And if Wyoming just made you question everything you thought you knew about America, hit subscribe because we are just getting started on Dumbest Things.